This is Tell Your Story Alaska. We talk aviation, history, theology, but most of all, the raw stories of Alaskans and the gospel. Welcome back to another episode of Tell Your Story Alaska. Today we're going to be discussing the Baha'i faith in Alaska. And I'll be honest, I had never heard of the Baha'i faith, and I was surprised to learn about how widespread this faith is throughout the world, and it's also present here in Alaska. Now, in front of me, I have quite a long list of topics I want to cover about Alaska, and I've had trouble choosing one. And I'm the sort of person who kind of jumps around with all these different things that I want to study, and my brain hops around. I don't know if you're that way, but I had to force myself to sit down and come up with a coherent transcript for talking about the Baha'i, because I want to study so many different things at once, these things in Alaska, and I've got quite a growing list of things. And so I have more ideas than I have time to implement. So, and once summer comes, I'm just not going to have any time to record. So you'll have to bear with me, but at least for today, we're going to discuss the Baha'i faith in Alaska. Now, I have watched a handful of videos about the Baha'i faith, and I've done quite a bit of reading on the Baha'i websites. I was a little frustrated. I wasn't able to find any data about the number of adherents in Alaska, but there is some history of the Baha'i in Alaska, which I will talk about. So I can't tell you how many Baha'i adherents are in Alaska, but I know that they're here. According to a introductory video on the Baha'i website of Alaska, the video is called The Baha'i Worldview. You can check it out yourself. It says, and I quote, "Baha'u'llah teaches that there is one God and that all religions are part of one divinely revealed process by which God makes his will and purpose known to humanity. Although we may differ in our concepts of God's nature, although we may pray in different languages and call God by different names, we are speaking about that same transcendent being." So right off the bat, you can see there's sort of a unifying of different ideas of God under one belief system. It also says on the website, quote, "Baha'i beliefs address such essential themes as the oneness of God and religion, the oneness of humanity and freedom from prejudice, the inherent nobility of the human being, the progressive revelation of religious truth, the development of spiritual realities, the integration of worship and service, the fundamental equality of the sexes, the harmony between religion and science, the centrality of justice to all human endeavors, the importance of education and the dynamics of the relationships that are to bind together individuals, communities, and institutions as humanity advances towards its collective maturity." So I just start with those quotes so you can start getting a feel for what the faith of the Baha'i is all about. Really a lot of talk about unity, the oneness of religion and humanity, and they have a lot of quotes regarding these themes. Now, the Baha'i in Alaska began with someone named Agnes Alexander. This person was the first Baha'i to visit Alaska in 1905. She was on her way back to Hawaii aboard a vessel that stopped in communities along the Inside Passage of Southeast Alaska, where she gave several talks introducing the Baha'i teachings in Ketchikan, Skagway, Sitka, and Wrangell. The first Baha'i to reside in Alaska was Margaret Green, who taught the faith in Juneau from 1915 to 1918, while supporting herself by working as a public librarian. Although there had been several traveling Baha'is and some temporary residents in Alaska in the 1920s, it was not until 1939 that the Baha'i faith was permanently established in Alaska. By 1940, there were Baha'is in Anchorage, Fairbanks, and Juneau. Over the years, Entire Baha'i families settled in Alaska. Some acquired and developed large homesteads such as the Huffmans and the Gregorys in the Anchorage area. Okay, I'm reading kind of the history of the Baha'is in Alaska from their website here. It says the first indigenous Alaskan to join the faith, Melba King, was living in New Mexico at the time of her enrollment in 1943. While the first indigenous Alaskan became a Baha'i in Alaska was Agnes Harrison in 1949. The Baha'i community governs itself by means of elected councils, referred to as spiritual assemblies. They are elected annually by the adult Baha'is at local and national levels. So for Alaska in 1943, the first Baha'i local spiritual assembly in Alaska was formed in Anchorage. In February of 1948, this Anchorage Baha'i Assembly was legally incorporated under Alaska territorial statutes. By 1949, the Baha'i marriage service was recognized by the Attorney General for Alaska. The establishment of the Baha'i local spiritual assemblies of Fairbanks, 1955, Tanana Valley, 1956, Ketchikan, 1956, and Juneau, 1957, and was followed in 1957 by the formation and legal incorporation of the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of Alaska. From 1960 up to the present day, there has been the continued growth of the faith in Alaska, and Baha'i continues to be found throughout the entire state, focused on spreading Baha'u'llah's teaching of love, unity, and equality. So in short, the Baha'i faith was introduced into Alaska in 1905, and it became basically firmly established in 1957, and it is still present throughout Alaska today. I know that they have a facility in Anchorage as sort of the center of the Baha'i in Alaska, and there are smaller communities or groups throughout towns and villages throughout the state. So let's take a look at what the Baha'i faith is. Now that we've established it's here in Alaska, there's a handful of adherents. I don't know how many. I wish so much I could find that data, but I couldn't. I looked on the Pew Research website. It's just not listed there. So it may be the case that there's not a lot of adherents, but it is present in Alaska. So what is the Baha'i faith? I searched through their website, and I watched a handful of videos. One of the really helpful ones, believe it or not, was from the actor Rainn Wilson, also known as Dwight Schrute from The Office. He has become probably the most famous Baha'i adherent, and he's become sort of a Baha'i evangelist. He might not like that word, but he has a YouTube channel, a podcast, and he also has an introductory video for people looking into the Baha'i, and I watched that one. And so it was really helpful for me understanding what the Baha'i faith is. So what is the Baha'i faith? Well, the founder is a man from Persia named Baha'u'llah. His name means the glory of God. The Baha'is are the most geographically wide religion in the world outside of Christianity. A very interesting fact. In South Carolina, they're the second biggest religion outside of Christianity. There's an estimated 6 to 7 million active members throughout the world, but this number is hard to say because some members that are included in that number are likely not active. But it's, to their credit, it is hard to count this sort of thing. But the general consensus seems to be 6 to 7 million worldwide adherents. The largest population of people of the Baha'i faith is in India, with an estimated 2 million members. Like I said, Rainn Wilson, also known as Dwight from The Office, is very famous for effectively being a missionary or evangelist or a spokesperson. Not officially, but he's very outspoken and a prominent figure for the Baha'i faith. There are a handful of other actors and musicians or famous people who identify as Baha'i also. The Baha'i have legitimately been horribly persecuted in Iran, in the Muslim world. They claim to be the fastest growing religion in the world, but actually most religions also claim that. So you could take that with what you will. Most religions have comments about who Jesus is, and for the Baha'i, Jesus is one of 9 great manifestations of God. So, according to the Baha'i, God acts upon men in different ages or cycles, and there's been 9 of them. The 9 manifestations are Abraham, the biblical Abraham, Krishna, Zoroaster, Moses, Buddha, Jesus, Muhammad, the Bab, and Baha'u'llah. Now, Baha'u'llah is the latest manifestation of God in the current authority figure for spiritual truths for us today, according to the Baha'i faith. So you can think of these 9 manifestations throughout history as updates. Even in Rainn Wilson's video, he compares this to updating your iPhone. So if you have like an iPhone 8 and you want to update, you'll get the 9 or the 10 or whatever, however they do the numbers. It's like getting an upgrade to a better version. And so in this way, the Baha'i faith is like a progressive revelation, or these different ages of different revelations of God that each era needs for God's own purposes. They are headquartered in Israel, believe it or not, and there are beautiful temples for the Baha'i throughout the world. Notably, there's one in Wilmot, Illinois, just outside of Chicago, which is my stomping grounds, although I don't think I've ever seen it. The numbers 9 and 19 are sacred numbers, which is reflected in their architecture. So one of their symbols is actually a 9-pointed star, which is up on the top corner of their Alaska Baha'i website. Baha'i is an offshoot of Shia Islam. They want to have a one world government. Sometimes they even call it the New World Order. They would say, quote, "The earth is but one country and mankind its citizens," unquote. There's a huge emphasis on love, togetherness, getting along, and unity. And a skeptic might say it's got a very kumbaya feel to it. You might hear words that you hear on the modern American political left, such as social justice, unity, equality of men and women, a citizen of the world, one world government, science and education. Some of the goals are the equality of men and women, the harmony of science and religion, the independent investigation of truth, universal education, the elimination of prejudice, elimination of poverty, spiritual solutions to economic problems, a universal language, universal peace upheld by a world government enforced by an international tribunal. There are 3 foundational principles. Number 1 is the oneness of God. 2 is the oneness of religion. And 3 is the oneness of mankind. Baha'i faith claims to be for all religions, and they have a strong emphasis on love and unity. So you can be a Hindu, a Buddhist, a Jewish, a Christian, a Muslim, and you can also be a member of the Baha'i faith. So that can give you, that's just just a broad brush over of the Baha'i faith, but it draws this picture that they have a view of the world that is progressing towards peace and harmony and unity and the oneness of humanity, kind of a one world government, all living under one umbrella in peace and harmony together is where sort of the Baha'i faith is going. So they're addressing, they're trying to achieve this in a spiritual manner. There are 4 key figures. I know I mentioned 9 manifestations, but in recent history, there are 4 key figures in the Baha'i faith. The first one is called the Bab. The Bab is B-A-B, not B-O-B, which is my middle name, my dad's first name. But the Bab, B-A-B, but the Bab was a man named Ali Muhammad, who began sort of his ministry, if I can call it that, in 1844. Now, the Bab came from the Muslim world in the Middle East. For brief history of this, Muhammad, like the Islamic prophet Muhammad, from him there came 2 sects of Islam, the Shias and the Shiites. Now, from the Shias came another group called the Shakis, and from the Shakis came a guy known as the Bab, and his name was actually Ali Muhammad. Now, he chose the name for himself, the Bab, because the Bab means the gate, and he called himself the Gate because he announced in sometime between 1844 and 1850 the coming of a new era in which a coming manifestation of God would usher in the age of peace and justice promised in all the world's religions. Now, at the time, the Islamic government executed the Bab in 1850 in order to stop his movement, and so he passed away in 1850. But he appointed a man named Yahya Subiazal. You have to forgive my pronunciation. A man named Yahya Subiazal was meant to be his successor of this new movement. But this man's brother was a much better speaker, and his name was Hussein Ali Nuri, who actually ended up taking over, and he became Baha'u'llah. He kind of called himself Baha'u'llah, but his real name was Hussein Ali Nuri. He became the authoritative figure for the Baha'i faith. At the time of his rise, violence and murder broke out between various groups, but the government put an end to that violence by putting the Baha'u'llah under house arrest in 1868 by the Turkish government, and eventually he died in 1892 in a penal colony. The Baha'u'llah, or Hussein Ali Nuri, he wrote a handful of authoritative texts. He had 3 wives, and they say he never actually met the Bab. When the Baha'u'llah passed away in 1892, he passed his authority to his son, a man named Abdul Baha, and in 1892, his son, Abdul Baha, became an infallible interpreter of his father's writings. Now, his son was named Shoghi Effendi. Shoghi Effendi was appointed guardian of the faith in 1921 when Abdul Baha passed away, and he became the infallible interpreter, and he became known as the guardian of the faith. And Shoghi Effendi himself had no children, and he died in 1957, and he did not appoint a successor, which apparently is a controversial item within the faith. However, he did appoint a group of people called the Hands of the Cause, and they acted as custodians of the faith until they established the Universal House of Justice, which is now sort of the governing body over the faith. The Universal House of Justice is made up of 9 elected leaders every 5 years. There's something called Universal Spiritual Assemblies and Local Spiritual Assemblies as lower governing bodies. 9 is a very important number as there are 9 manifestations of God throughout history, which I listed before. 17 is also a prominent number, and also 19. Baha'u'llah's writings are authoritative writings written in the 1870s. These are basically a New World Order instruction manual, and they are said to be Islamic in flavor since it comes out of the Shias of Islam. The goal is a religious world authority. In Baha'u'llah is said there will not be another leader like him or another manifestation for at least 1,000 years. So what I'd like to do now is do a little independent investigation of truth, which is, and I say that word intentionally because in their list of values, it's even on their website, they say they value the independent investigation of truth. And so I did that, and I'd like to talk about a handful of things. Let's see, how many do I have here? I've got 7 issues that I have with the fundamentals of the Baha'i faith. Now, before I go into these, it needs to be said that I acknowledge and recognize that they have an intention of doing what's best for humanity. Their intention is the healing and unity and bringing peace to humanity. And this, of course, is an admirable cause. And I'm going to explain why I don't have a problem with that goal, but what I do have a problem with is that it's just fundamentally false. And so I'm going to go into those things. And so my number 1 here is that they claim and emphasize an equality of the sexes between men and women. And yet only men are allowed to be members of the Universal House of Justice, which has 9 members, and only men are allowed to be on that board. I think that seems to be a bit odd, and maybe there's reasons for it. I haven't found reasons why they emphasize the equality of the sexes, and yet only women or only men are allowed to be in the Universal House of Justice. Okay, number 2, it's a little bit odd that over the millennia, there were these 9 manifestations, and suddenly there was 2 in a row that happened one after another. They call them the twin manifestations. So there's the Bab and the Baha'u'llah, which happened just one after the other. It's just inconsistent with the history of the manifestations. I guess they're saying that this one's extra special, but it is, I'm just saying it's suspect that there are 2, one after another, which is inconsistent with the passage of time between all of the other ones. So the claim is just a little suspect, but it is not a refutation of the truth claims or anything like that. I'm just saying it's a little odd that this was a quite a bit different one. Okay, number 3. None of the other manifestations claim to be a progressive manifestation of God until Baha'u'llah claimed this in the 1800s. So, for example, like Buddha never claimed to be a progressive manifestation of God, or Abraham never claimed this, Moses never claimed this, Jesus never claimed this, Muhammad never claimed it. So in other words, Baha'u'llah made claims about these other manifestations like Abraham and Muhammad that they did not make about themselves. And what Baha'u'llah is claiming about them contradicts what these other manifestations taught. So there's internal contradictions here. So as an example, Jesus claimed to be God himself, not just a manifestation, not just a prophet, but he claimed to be God himself. The book of Hebrews says of him that Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. In Luke 24, he claims that Moses and the prophets and the Psalms wrote about him. And there's plenty of other scriptures that point to the entirety of the Old Testament, point towards Christ. And the New Testament looks back at Christ and, of course, gives us also a forward perspective of the end of all things. In other words, Jesus is presented as the centerpiece of human history and the entire narrative of the Bible. He's not presented as one of many progressive revelations or manifestations. So, in other words, what Jesus claimed about himself is fundamentally different than what Baha'u'llah claims Jesus is. The Baha'i faith claims that the resurrection of Jesus never happened, but Jesus himself predicted his own death and resurrection, and even the Apostle Paul teaches that if Jesus did not resurrect, then his faith is false or vain. So by claiming Jesus never resurrected, they claim that he is false by Jesus' own words. But they're also claiming he's a legit manifestation. So I see contradiction here in Baha'u'llah's claims. There must be a twisting of Jesus' words or downplaying to make the claim that he was one in a line of progressive manifestations. If you talk about Muhammad claimed to be the final prophet of Allah, and there's none coming after him authoritative like him. This contradicts Baha'u'llah's claim that someone like Muhammad is in a line of progressive revelations. Muhammad himself claimed to be the final revelation of Allah, and so this is contradictory. Now there is a quote from Baha'u'llah. He says, quote, "Know thou assuredly that the essence of the prophets of God is one and the same. To prefer one in honor to another, to exalt certain ones above the rest, is in no way to be permitted." So that's what he said, but effectively he's asking us to listen to his words over the words of Muhammad or Jesus or Moses or some of the others. So in other words, he's saying we need to hold them in equal regard, but actually not. This, I think, is a problem. So in short, Baha'u'llah claimed that these 9 men were legitimate manifestations, and then he contradicts their teachings. This, I think, is a fundamental problem in the Baha'i faith. Okay, number 4. The Baha'i faith claims to be inclusive of all religions, but their truth claims contradict many religions. So they're actually being exclusive, but they claim to be inclusive. The problem with any claim at all made is that claims are inherently exclusive. So, for example, they say that God is one, religions are one, but other religions reject this. And so, by making any claim at all, you're inherently exclusive, but they're claiming to be inclusive of all faiths. For example, like Buddhism doesn't claim any God at all. Hinduism claims millions of gods. Christians claim a Trinitarian God. Mormons claim that you will become a God. And the Baha'i claim there is one singular God. These are all claims made by some of these 9 manifestations, and they all contradict each other. This is fundamentally a problem. The Baha'i faith teaches there is no heaven or hell. But Jesus taught constantly on the subjects of heaven and hell. So is it the case then that in the age of Jesus there was a heaven and hell, but in the age of Baha'u'llah there's no heaven and hell? So apparently the existence of such things can change over time. So it follows that Baha'u'llah's teachings will be false one day, maybe in 1,000 years, with another manifestation. Will the truth change then when the next manifestation comes? If this is the case, then truth then isn't really truth. They're just ideas for certain times and certain ages in human history. They're not actually true. They're just ideas that apply to certain ages. So they're not truth claims. They're more like ideas for a time. I think this is just simply illogical. All right, number 5. The leadership in the Baha'i faith changed their authoritative text when a prophecy of the Baha'u'llah did not come to pass. Now, Baha'u'llah once commented on the biblical book of Daniel, about the 1,335 days mentioned in the book of Daniel. And Baha'u'llah said that those days are actually years, and those years start on the year that Muhammad fled from Mecca to Medina, which was 622 AD. So if you do the math, that comes to 1957. And his comments on this, on the end of these years, which comes to 1957, he claimed it would be the year of, quote, universal peace established, a universal language promoted, misunderstandings will pass away, the Baha'i cause will be promulgated in all parts, and the oneness of mankind will be established. It will be most glorious. Now, if you still have a 1930 edition of the book of the Baha'i, their authoritative text, this quote is still there. And this book was read by Shoghi Effendi, who was the guardian of the faith at the time, and he declared that this book is authoritative, and he gave it his cordial approval. However, I think all of us know that this did not happen in 1957. There was not universal peace established. There was not a universal language promoted. Misunderstandings did not pass away. There was not a oneness of mankind in 1957. So it's clearly a false prophecy. And something interesting here is that in later editions of the Baha'u'llah text, notably the 1980 edition, that passage was changed. It was completely removed. And now in its place, it says, this prophecy, the 1,335 years from Muhammad's trip to Medina, this prophecy refers to the 100th anniversary of the declaration of the Baha'u'llah in Baghdad, or the year of 1963. I don't know why the year changes to 1963. I actually did the math. It is 1957, but they changed it to say that, and they removed what it said in the 1930 edition. This change is notable, and this is what we might call censorship or trying to save their skin. The previous quote making this prophecy is just simply gone. Now, this sort of behavior is the mark of a cult. Now, the Baha'i would reject this categorization of cult, and that's fine. I don't want to use a word just to trigger people. What we want to get at is the reality of what's happening. It is the mark of many cults. is censorship and changing their authoritative text to ensure its survival. Now, in contrast, the Bible has thousands and thousands of manuscripts, tens of thousands, and they have different families of manuscripts, and there's so many copies of it. Changes like this really can't be made without it being obviously noticed. So there is accountability in the large number of biblical manuscripts. The biblical text, there's a strong argument to say that it has not been changed over the years, and that's a different discussion, but it seems pretty clear that there are still 1930 editions of Baha'u'llah's book out there, and it does have this 1957 prophecy in it, and then the 1980 edition, that prophecy is removed. So they value independent investigation of truth, but it looks like they are changing their texts in order to make them seem more legitimate. So how can you trust their authority if they're changing things? It's kind of a top-down deception. All right, number 6, the Baha'i fails to admit the fallen nature of man. Now, this is admittedly a Christian concept, a biblical concept, is the idea of original sin, the fallen nature of man. However, we see the doctrine of original sin, which is from Christianity. We see it all around us every day. Okay, I have kids. I've never had to teach my kids to be bad, but I have to put in a lot of effort to teach them to be good. Now, modern people, specifically people kind of on the political left, don't like this idea of people being having a sin nature. So like we're made in God's image, we are precious, and there's a goodness to that. But we're also fallen, and we have a sin nature in us. They don't like that, but if we look at the world around us, if we study history, this is a sad reality. If you look at our justice system is based on the punishment. It's based on punishment to mitigate our sinful nature. So if you do this, you will go to jail. And so we have to have like a negative consequence in order to mitigate the sinful nature of man. The idea that we will progressively become morally better people over time is simply negated by history. The 20th century was the deadliest century in world history. More people died in that 100 years than the 19 previous centuries combined. Now, some of the most aggressive attempts at utopia here on Earth were attempted in the 20th century, and this manifested in the worst evils that human history has ever seen. So the pursuit of a one-world government is also, biblically speaking, the opposite of the story of the Tower of Babel. In the Tower of Babel, in the book of Genesis, it presents that the unifying of humanity under one governmental body was a problem. It was a unified rebellion against God. And this was only mitigated by dispersing the people throughout the earth by confusing the languages. And this actually brought more peace. And this was God's way of mitigating the sinful human nature that they had and to bring about his redemptive plan in world history. And so this unifying under one umbrella, unity, peace, this is not a biblical concept. The biblical concept is a dispersion of people to mitigate the sinful nature of man. So to set a vision for mankind without factoring in the true nature of man will end in total disaster because it's based on a false premise. Now, interestingly, the eschatology of the Bible, or end times, tells us this is exactly what's going to happen, sort of a unifying one world deal. And when this kind of manifests, Christ will return, and we're kind of seeing the early stages of this today. So in other words, the Baha'i faith is an attempt to make heaven on earth progressively, and the Christian faith promises to restore heaven on earth after Christ's return. One is man pursuing heaven, and the other is Christ bringing heaven for man. Okay, the last one, and this one admittedly is a little bit petty, but it was just notable when I watched Rainn Wilson's introduction to the Baha'i faith video. It's on YouTube. I think it has 1.4 million views, so it has been watched quite a bit. And he starts off the video by saying that there are no priests, bishops, or gurus in the Baha'i faith. And then later on, he describes the 9 manifestations, specifically the Baha'u'llah of the faith. I mean, how are these not what he's saying the Baha'i faith doesn't have? These gurus, these spiritual authorities. And I think he's trying to contrast like Christian faiths or other faiths that have these priests or gurus or authorities with the Baha'i faith, but then he talks about these gurus. And I know that's a little bit of a petty skepticism, but it was just one of the first things I noticed watching his video. But I do want to give Rainn Wilson some credit. He does a very brief explanation of Christianity, and he does it in a very gracious way. He says, I know this is overly simplistic, but this is basically Christianity. And I thought he did a good job of presenting it in a very simple way. And he admitted it was simple, and I appreciated that he did his best to accurately describe Christianity. And I hope that I've genuinely done my best to accurately describe the Baha'i faith. I began this podcast with just a basic description. Most of it was quotes from their own website, trying to accurately describe their goals and their aims and what they are and what they believe, and then shared my problems with it. I don't mean to come down hard or mean. I hope it was heard as truth and love. But just let me conclude with this. In short, the Baha'i faith claims inclusivity while being exclusive. It recategorizes historical religious figures in ways those figures never claimed. It fails to take into account the sinful nature of man claimed by the Bible and as we have seen throughout history. And it has a clearly failed prophecy, which they apparently tried to cover up. So I have an appreciation for the intention behind the Baha'i faith. They want to make the world a better, more loving, more peaceful, more unified place. But according to Scripture, according to the Bible, which they say is one of the 9 manifestations, we cannot make heaven on earth because of the fallen nature of man. Our only hope is in Christ bringing it for us. We do not merit it ourselves. We are recipients of God's grace, and our hope is in His restoration of the world, not by our human efforts to bring about some kind of utopia on earth. I think this is actually a dangerous notion given our fallen and sinful nature. And I think the Baha'i makes a fundamental mistake in saying that people are basically good. It is simply not what the Bible teaches, and they claim the Bible and Jesus is a legitimate and should be listened to manifestation of God, but it contradicts Baha'u'llah's teaching, and this is a fundamental issue. All right, I really like to finish this off just by reading a scripture to draw a contrast between the message of Jesus in Scripture and the Baha'u'llah messaging are fundamentally different from each other. The Baha'i teach that our hope is for a progressive movement into a utopian future, but the biblical hope, according to Scriptures, the Bible, we are eagerly waiting for Christ's return to restore all things. In other words, we will be the recipient of this restoration that all of us want, rather than us manifesting it ourselves. And I'd like to close with Ephesians chapter 2, verse 8, which is a good summary of the gospel. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing, it is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast. All right, guys, so thank you for listening to the Baha'i faith. I hope I spoke sensitively but also firmly about the Baha'i faith. Thank you for tuning in. I hope this tickled your brain cells a little bit and got you thinking a little bit more about Alaska, the faiths and the belief systems that are here. And I hope that there will be more of things like this to come.